right, so this is our third video in the series. In this video, we're going to cover the styles panel. So in our
Right.
life cycle of how far along we are, if this was like teaching how to drive a car, you now know how to get in, turn it on, and put it in reverse. So now we could actually learn some of the actual stuff. So let me pop over the screen here. All right, so this entire right panel is called our styles panel. Can you see my mouse right here?
There you are. Yes, now I can.
Okay, so this entire window is your the styles panel. So as you'll notice right now, there's no options to do anything on our little paintbrush icon. And that's because we have nothing on the canvas. So I'm going to hit our shortcut and I'm going to hit Command E. I'm going to pull in a div block. So just div and then hit enter and it'll pop up. All right. So now you'll see this entire window of settings under the paintbrush. So this is where we're going to start. All right, so I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview, and then in our next video, we'll actually start putting elements on the page and actually start playing with stuff. But for now, I'm just going to kind of go over what these elements do, so that way when we start talking about them, you'll kind of have a reference point to them. So
could you go over one more time the four things: the paintbrush and the gear and the along the top of the styles panel?
Yes.
And over to the lightning bolt, please. I know you covered that to begin with, but I don't remember those.
All right, so the first one is our CSS, our styles for the elements. Okay. The second one is settings specific to the element. So for example, like div blocks, you're not going to see that many elements. You can add custom attributes, which is something we'll talk about way further down the road. And otherwise, there's this tag section where you can let search crawlers know what it is. So it could be the header, it could be the footer, the navigation. It's a section, it could be an article. So whenever we're building like a new section, we'll come in here and tag it. And then there's this ID slot, and that is where you would go in if you want to do like anchor scrolls. So somebody would click a button instead of jumping to a new page, it would drop it. Right. This is where you would tag those. And then the third one, this just shows you all the classes you have on your project. So when we go to the art brush, you'll notice there's a selector where you can select a class or tag. Right now, the only ones we have are section and style. We added those in the previous video. So this will just show the list of all of the styles you've created or are on your project. So you notice right here, there's this little cleanup button. And because we don't have any styles applied to our website or to our elements on the website, you can go in and clean up any classes you're not using. So I can click clean up and I can click remove and it'll delete all unused styles. So let's say you would name this div block, header element, and then you rename it something later, you can come into the project setting and clean it up. So that's what this does. It'll show you all your styles you've created, or you can clean them up. And this last one is interactions. And if we're talking about teaching someone how to drive a car, this is the stunts, the tricks, all the fun stuff. So this is where you add
I remember that. Yep. All right.
All of the interactions and stuff. So this is kind of something that this is a portion of making the website feel interactive, but definitely something we'll cover later on. Okay. So this styles manager, you're not going to need to worry about, because even if you do have some classes that you'll be duplicating, it's sometimes safer not to go and clean them up. Let's say you had some classes you wanted used, but they weren't in use. If you clean them up, it would delete all of them. So we're not going to really pay attention here. And this section is only going to be important for doing anchor scrolling or tagging our sections or adding custom attributes. So this one's not really that important at the moment. So our main focus is going to be the paintbrush, the styles panel.
And really the element triggers is really the overdoing stuff that really is down the road stuff too. So really it is just the paintbrush, the styles that is our.
You're talking about this one? The element?
Correct.
Yes. Yeah, the interaction.
So really it is just this.
Yeah, so it kind of goes, your three-step process are left panel, where you bring your elements on. Then you use the paintbrush to style those elements. And then you use the lightning bolt to add interactions to the styled element. So it's a 1, 2, 3, left to right. Start here, go here, and then finish up here. That's kind of your rough way of doing things. All right, so we're going to touch briefly and try to go over all of the elements. in this styles panel, so you at least have a brief understanding of them. We're not necessarily going to utilize them and implement them on this video. We'll do that in the next one. But this way, when we start talking about stuff, you'll have already kind of had an entire overview of everything. All right, so the very first thing you have right here is the class adder. So this is how you name everything. So if you notice right now, we've got a div block on the screen. All right. If, let's say, we add a random, let's say we add just a padding, or margin, we'll explain later. You'll notice it now automatically gave it a class. Did you see that?
When you say class, if you could define the word class, please.
All right, so Webflow's got this really powerful, the classes are really powerful. So if you, let's say we wanted to make a certain set of styles to an element, and then you wanted to use that multiple times over, instead of having to go in and re-add those settings, you can just apply the class. And when a class is applied to something, it'll automatically inherit those styles. And then when you change an item on one thing that has a class, it'll change it on all of them. So everything you're going to add, every element you're going to add to the canvas will either be a custom class, which means it'll be the only one given that class, or it'll be you'll apply a class to it, something you've already designed. So let's say you're building on, go ahead.
So this is kind of like what we talked about with the symbols, is overall to to the nav bar or to a group of items. This is to a specific singular, could be to a singular div block.
Yes. Yep. That's a good way of looking at it. Yes. So everything on your artboard will be given a class, and it'll either be a custom class, so the settings you're applying to that are specifically for that element, or you'll create a class and then you'll apply it. Let's say you're building a website and all of the background is white. Okay. You will then have dark text on it. But let's say on one of your pages, the whole background is black and you want white text. So in our styles panel, when you have the text element out, we can make a class and call it white. And that means anytime you have a new text element, you can go in and just add the class white, and it'll automatically apply the color white to that text. Does that make sense?
All right, I know there's some strategy going on here, and I don't necessarily understand the strategy yet.
Okay, well, maybe we'll move on from classes. We'll just utilize that's probably the second most important, or maybe the first most important thing in the entire web design process are going to be the classes. So we'll just keep moving on, but now you know this is where you will create a new class. So we've got the div block selected, and we could give it a class of, let's say, main div. All right, okay. Now let's use our Command E and add another div on here. This is what I was going to kind of do in the next video, but we'll kind of start just so you kind of understand. So right now, our main div has a class, and this div block does not have a class. So if we make a change and say, I'm going to make this, I want every element to be 70 pixels away. You'll notice this div block did not also separate itself from the previous div block by 70 pixels. However, if we now go over here, and we can either type in main div or just select it because we can see it, it now has created that same pixel spacing as the other one. And so now
because they both have the same class.
Yes, and now any change we make to the one that has a class makes the change everywhere.
Because it's a cascading class.
Well, because they have the same classes applied. Cascading refers to going to like different breakpoints, and it cascades down. Okay,
all right.
Yes. All right. So that's the first thing. That's how you just apply and name classes. So if something doesn't have a class, oops, escape. I don't know what I did there. Okay, we'll do that. If something does not have a class, you'll just start in here and type. You'll either give it a new class or find the class you have. So I'd either add it as main div. So that's what this thing's for. This is where you select your classes. All right, so the next thing is your layout settings. And this is the second most important thing.
Sorry, you said something that I thought might be really important. You said either everything has a class of its own, or did I misunderstand that? Everything either has a custom class or is assigned how did you phrase that? Or did I misunderstand that?
Well, I don't know what you understood, so I'll just re-explain it. So you don't want to, if I start adding in div blocks, okay? So if I add in, oops, let's drag that over here. If I just add in 5 div blocks, all right, if I don't give it a class and I start making a change to it, it's just going to start, if you'll notice in the left side, it's now just naming them div block 2, div block 3, div block 4, right?
Yep.
And so we'll have no way of knowing what that div block is trying to do. So you'll either give every div block already set of a class. So for example, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to already give this main div. Okay, so I want everything, I'm going to give it, assign it to a class that already is created, right? So that's one option.
Okay.
Or you create a new class. So instead of this automatically naming itself, you would call this secondary nav. So we just don't leave things randomly saying div block. So now this div block, we're either going to assign it to secondary nav, or secondary nav, or main div, one of those two. So we don't just let things have random classes.
So that they'll have the same attributes as the previous divs.
Yes, and you want to try as much as possible to give things the same classes if you can, so that way when you make a change, it changes everywhere. So that's classes. We're going to delete all this.
Oops. And that's the formatting, obviously not just and then the content will be different.
Yeah, as soon as you drag an element onto the page, you are either assigning it to a class. So this new div block, I'm either going to immediately assign it main div, or I'm going to know it's a custom class, and then I'll name this custom div, and then I'll go make my changes. Does that make sense?
So you wouldn't necessarily name it according to where it is on the page. You would name it according to the formatting structure.
No, well, we didn't talk about naming strategies. No, you'll name it. There's a whole different naming strategy we haven't gotten to yet.
Okay.
But this is just where you add classes. So when I say, oh, you need to add a different class, this is where you'll find it.
Got it.
All right, so the next section is the layout, and this affects how the element behaves. So this will mainly apply to div blocks. So there are what 6 or 7 different options. So do you see these right here?
Yep.
These are all your different layout options. So we'll kind of go over them. So everything starts off right here. It's a block element, which means it will take up the full width of the page. This block takes up the full width of it. And that's how it stacks. If I had another div block, it keeps adding them inside. So I got to just Command E. Actually, let's do a heading real quick. That'll be easier to see. And then we'll add Command E. We'll add another heading. All right, so the standard block, even though this heading thing only takes up, 10-20% of the entire screen, because it's set to this layout, the other heading won't jump up. So that's the first one, just the standard setting. So the next one, this one right here, it's kind of hard to tell them apart, is inline block. So you notice as I selected it, it went from laying out the entire width of the page to just the space it's taking up.
Right.
So if I now set this one to inline block, they'll share a row. Okay. So inline block allows elements to come to the same space that they otherwise wouldn't be. So if I now put this one back to here, it won't go up even though this one's set to inline block.
Yep.
All right, so that's the second one. So this is inline text, which is the same thing as inline block, but only applies to text.
Yep.
Then we have this one right here. So this is hide the element. So if we click this, it will hide the element from the page. So hiding it is different from deleting it. So you'll still see it over here in the navigator, but you'll notice you can't select it. There's no way to find it over here. So any hidden elements, you'll need to go and find them in the navigator, and you'll see that it's hidden by that little symbol right here. That means it's hidden. Right. So a quick example where you'd use this, let's say you were going to make an interaction where as you scroll down the page, something kind of pops into view. You can set that as hidden first, and then once the page is scrolled, you'll set the interaction to show it once it's scrolled. So there's a lot of utility in the display now.
Interesting.
All right, so the most commonly used ones, and these kind of get complicated. So the first most common is the basic one, the block element, and then it goes Flexbox and grid. So Flexbox and grid are a way for you to sort the content inside a div block. So let's Command E, let's grab a div. And right now it's just taking up the entire space. So a grid, which one would suggest, allows you to place content very neatly and quickly inside of a grid. So we'll notice a couple things, a couple settings we have here on our grid. You can, from right over here, change how much width is between the rows and the columns. So you can adjust this. You can, go 32. You can double it, and then you can also determine how many rows and columns you have. So right here, you've got these columns and row settings. So we can add more rows, we can add more columns, and they just add it in. So the really powerful thing about grids in Webflow is you'll notice there's a sizing right here. It's called 1FR. So normally when you've got elements on a page, you'll give them pixel values, rem values, or percentage values. So an FR stands for, I think it's just a fractional value. So it's one fraction of the total width. So
interesting.
So as the page shrinks, it still takes up its, instead of, let's say your page right now is 1,000 pixels. If you set something to 330 pixels, hoping it'll take up a third, if you shrink your browser, that first item will become more than the third of the width. So you can set a fractional value. So right here, if I go up here and click this, and I now change it to 2 FRs and then hit enter, it's now twice as wide as everything else.
Right.
And then I can come down here on the height ones, and instead of being auto, I can change it to 2 FR. And because the other ones are auto, it hasn't showed up yet, but I can do 1 FR when I have some content in there. So that's how you start a grid. So an interesting thing is that a grid slot can only take one element in it. Okay, so that's something to remember is if, let's say we grab a couple of, let's Command E, let's grab a heading, and Command E, and let's grab a paragraph. So you'll notice they do not go into the same section.
Yeah.
So to solve that, we would need to grab a div block, and inside this div block, we would drag, we can either grab the heading and paragraph and drag it on screen into this, which I think you have to hit Command. Yeah, you have to hit Command to do it, or we can just grab it from the navigator and drag it into the div block. So now our one section of the grid has both of the elements in it. And the way we did that was with the div block. And so anytime you get stuck inside grids, it's, should I put something in a div block? So for example, we would not let this be named div block. So we'd call this, grid first or something like that. And now we know when we're looking inside of our grid, we're like, oh, we know that's the first item. We can open up and see our heading and that. So that's div block, or that's grid. All right, so the next one, I'm going to grab another div block, and it's called Flexbox. So if grid allows you to set things up in evenly spaced X and Y axes, or the Flexbox allows you to kind of shift where they are in that plane. So you'll notice that our heading and paragraph still start on the left. They're not styled like, let's say we wanted them centered inside of our grid.
Okay.
Flexbox is a really cool way to utilize that. So when you make something a Flexbox, it pops up this whole window of settings. So it started in inline or regular. Then we hit Flexbox, and it's got all of these different combos. So let's add a couple elements in there. Let's add a couple headings. And then let's Command E, add another heading. And those automatically got added into the div block because I already had the div block selected when I hit Command E. Command E.
Yeah.
All right, so inside our div block, you'll notice that everything is going horizontal. We also have it set to horizontal. So if I now wanted to stack them vertically, I would just hit vertical.
Okay.
And then I can center them. I can align them to different ways. Let's say I wanted them to both be on the outsides. And then I can line them all the way out. This gave spacing. I can line them to the right. I can center align them. I can align them to the left. And all of these really cool settings where you can align them vertically, horizontally. So let's say I want to put that in the center. So we now have a grid. So this div block has a grid. And inside of this, is another div block, which we can now change to flex. So I can come down here and I can hit Flexbox. And now we can now align these vertically in the center.
Oh,
so
interesting.
inside our inside of our grid, we have a div block that's a Flexbox. And inside of our Flexbox, we can add grids just using stacked div blocks. So you'll notice that div blocks really are using almost every element of your website is going to have multiple div blocks, and we'll just give them classes so it doesn't clash. So that's what all these layout options do. So I'll come down. Let's delete all this. Let's grab another div block just so we have the settings window. All right, so that was our layouts tab. The next one is spacing. So anytime you want to move an object, you can, or you want to tweak an object here. Let's go Command E. Let's go bring up our heading. So inside of our div block, you'll notice our heading is all the way to the left. So we've got these now settings inside of our div block where we can add margin or padding to it and move the heading around. So if you'll notice, I'll add some padding and it'll push the item inwards. If I add some margin, it also pushes the image in, but margin is different because it's on the outside of the object. So that's really noticeable if we grab a button real quick. So if we grab our button, you'll notice right now it's got automatically 15 padding. So I can click, I'm hitting the shift button to change all of them. You'll notice it now changes the inside, like how far off from the edges is the button text. If we now change our margin, that'll push it off other elements. So if I go this way, it pushes it away from other elements.
Yep.
And then the padding is for that item. So that's pretty simple. There's margin and padding.
You're just clicking on that and dragging it in that little box inside.
Yeah, so you can either click on it once and just type in what you want for that item if you want them different. You can also just you hold on it and then you hit. So right now if I hold it and just drag left and right, it changes just this one. I can hit Command, or sorry, I can hit Shift and it'll do all of them. And then I can hit Alt and it'll just do the one on the opposite side of it.
Oh, okay. Nice.
All right, so we'll delete this, grab another one just so we have a clean canvas, and for fun, we'll put a heading in here. All right, another really cool thing is if you want something to have, let's actually change this heading. So we're going to change this heading to inline. We're going to go to layout, so it just takes up its space. If you automatically, let's say you want this heading in the middle. So instead of coming here and figuring out, I got to add all of this padding over here. All right, and now I've pushed it 400 pixels off of the side of the page, right? That looks pretty good. Now, if I went down to my tablet, you'll notice it's not centered because it's now counting how many pixels off the left it should be. So there's this cool little setting here. So we're going to clear that. So we'll hit reset. There's this nice little setting here, spacing, where it automatically puts it on either side. So we can add that to, okay, that should, maybe because I went inline and then center. There should be centering the content. I don't know why it's not. Auto. Got a fixed width. Oh, because I didn't give a max width. Oh, because we haven't gotten to that part yet. So let's say I added 1,000 pixels, and then now do auto padding. Okay. Well, I guess that's not working. So let's delete this div and let's do something else just because I did something wrong with that. Let's Command E, let's add a div. Inside this div, let's add another div. So I'll drag it in. And then on this div, we're going to do auto. And let's do Command E, add a heading into this div. All right, so now it's being difficult with me. And so this is where I need to do width of, let's do 500 pixels. And this width is 500 pixels. My heading element. Okay, well, I don't know why it's not working here, but it normally works. So we're just gonna move on, and I'm gonna have to
come back to this one.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to come back to that one. That's very strange. Of course, it does not want to work when we're trying to show it how it's supposed to work. All right, your next, so after you get off of spacing, your next one is your sizing. And so this is how you set parameters for the element on the web page. So you've got several settings here. So there's your regular width and height. Then you've got your minimum width and your minimum height, and your maximum width and your maximum height. So let's say you had an element that you wanted to have 500 pixels wide. So let's give it some height of also 200 pixels. Okay. So right now, that's about half the page. Now, if we go down to tablet, you'll notice, again, it's more than half. So we can come down here, and on our max width, we can do max width of 50 and then do the percent sign. All right, so now when we come down, you'll notice it's half on all of them. So we gave it a width and height of, so it's 500 pixels wide, but up to 50% of your screen. Yep. And so if you click on one of these little elements right here, you'll notice there are several different sizing options. So the most standard one, I guess if you use like Adobe products, you're very familiar with pixels.
Yep.
And then we've got percentages, which we just used. And then there's M and Rem. I don't know, are you familiar with those two?
I've only been familiar with Rem just because you've mentioned them before, but I'm not familiar with the M at all.
Okay, so
you better run me through both of them.
Yeah, so Rem, the R on instead of M is just for the root. So on your basic computer, you can adjust your general font size, how many pixels your font might be. And so a Rem will automatically, if you make something, all right, so I can go here and I'll make this div block 500 pixels and 200 pixels. So Command C, we're going to make another div block right beneath it. And so instead of getting it pixels, we're going to just go over here and 500 divided by 16 rem. So that's 31 rem. And then 200 pixels divided by 16 rem. All right, so now this is in rem sizing. So this top one, oh, I guess they're the same class. Haha. That's what happens when you make something the same class, so it changed on both. So rem sizing changes if the viewer wants the size to change. So if somebody had a hard time with, let's say they had bad vision and a hard time like reading text, if I had a heading on here and I set it to 16 pixels, and let's say they wanted everything to be twice that size, I would be able to set it as 1 rem, and whatever they set their base size on their computer, it adjusts with that. So for all of our builds, we use rem. We don't use pixels, and that's something we'll get into FinSuite later. That's something that they've documented on why you should use rem and why it's accessible to everybody. So we're not going to use M. We're going to try not to use percentages or pixels. So let's go over the other 4. So the next one is character. So it's CH. So character width. So let's open up a heading now. Let's see if the heading will cooperate this time. And right now we've got heading, text, a little more. All right, so right now we're going to pull it out of the div block so it's not confined by width. All right, so your CH width will set how many characters will be allowed to in that general. Actually, let's grab a paragraph that's a little easier to see. We'll delete all this. Command E, paragraph. All right, so if I wanted a certain amount of letters on each line, I can go in here and just type in, let's say I want 60 letters. So I'll type in 60 CH, and now it'll give me a width of 60 zeros of that font size.
Okay.
So that's really handy if you've got, let's say you have on your home screen or on your like hero section, you've got like 4 words, and on every screen size you want them to be 2 and 2. You can set a max character width, and that won't lock it in to the size of the screen. It won't adjust with that. It'll just keep the same characters on it. So that's CH characters. Then the VW and VH is vertical width and vertical height. So that sets something. So instead of, let's say, we get rid of this let's go from CH to VW. So this now will take up 60% of the width of the screen. So if we now go here, 60%, 60%, and 60%. That's what the vertical width does. It's similar to percentage, but there are some scenarios where they wouldn't line up, but we'll have to get down the road before we start talking about those. So that's vertical width, and same with vertical height. If we now change it to 100 VH, this would now, oh, sorry, because I'm putting that in the width. Get rid of that. So the height is 100 VH, and now it would take up the whole screen size.
Yeah.
So right in here, you can either type in the items. If you know like 100, I can type in 100 VW or VH, and it'll automatically grab them. Or you can just come over here, click on it, and grab them. All right, a couple of our next, so we don't have size, but right now the overflow is net. Okay, so the overflow, are you familiar with the overflow? Just regular overflow from WordPress.
Not sure.
Okay, so let's say I set the height of this div block to 300 pixels. If I had an image that was 500 pixels tall, it would be on the outside of that frame. So if I don't have, if I have the overflow set, anything outside of that element shows right here, visible shows content that overflows its container. Anytime you have something, let's say you want that image exactly 300 pixels by 300 pixels, you can set it to overflow hidden, and then anything that would fall outside those borders won't show. So it kind of just hides everything.
Oh, yeah.
For that. And then this scroll setting, let's say you had someone's bio, and it was like 80 lines long, and you only wanted it to appear 10 lines long in the design. You can hit scroll on the overflow, and if there is any extra content, it'll just keep it at 10 lines and give you a scroll. And auto will only show the scroll option if the content's longer. So let's say you have 4 bios and you give them a class of bio, so now they're all the same. If you have the scroll option, it'll show the scroll bar even if their bio isn't longer than the 10 lines. And the auto will only show the scroll bar if it's longer than 10 lines. Okay, so the next thing after size is position. So this allows you to manipulate items around the screen, even though they're not in accordance with the navigator. So everything starts out by being static, which means it'll just follow proper HTML structure. So let's say let's grab another div block. So static is the first one, and the next one is relative. So as soon as I selected that, you'll notice that it popped up this window. Okay, so the relative sizing allows you to move the object relative to its original placement in the document. So if you'll notice right here that it's right next, it's following this div block, I can now move it, like I can overlap div blocks, I can move it all the way down while it's still taking its original spot. So it's still holding this original spot as a placeholder, and now you can manipulate it around. So let's say you had a white background, and then beneath it you changed to a black background, and you had an image that you wanted to be 50% on each of the backgrounds. You could change it to relative positioning and move it so that it was exactly half and half. So like right now I can see I pop it right at half on that div, and that's what relative does. So there are 3 more. So absolute makes the position of the item relative to the entire browser. So if you've ever seen like those little chat modals or accessibility modals, you fix them absolutely to someone's browser so that it would always show up in the bottom right of someone's browser.
Gotcha.
So that's what absolute does. All right. Or wait, is that fixed? Oh, I might have actually misspoken. All right, sorry. That is the fixed one. Fixed, yep. Positions the element relative to the browser. So that's fixed. Absolute. Oh, absolute positions it to the element. It's like parent element. So right now it would be this. All right, so I explained to you fixed. All right, so fixed is the one where it's fixed to the browser. Absolute changes it relative to its parent item. So for it to work on absolute, you have to have set the parent item to relative. So let's say let's do Command E, let's grab a div block, let's set this one to relative, and then let's throw this div block in here. you'll now notice that this inner block that we've set to absolute is now relative to the previous one. So relative changed its position corresponding to the next element. Does that make sense? Let's add it here. Okay, so if I do Command E and I add in several divs, let's delete the absolute one. All right, so if I move this middle div and I do relative, you'll notice I can change it around, but the middle spot right here is left open. If I change this now to absolute, it does not leave that spot open. I can still set it where I want it. I can still set it between these, but it does not take up its original space.
Okay.
So if you, so there's some, we'll have to get into how you would actually utilize it, but if you're just trying to move something a few pixels, you probably, and you want it to keep its original placeholder, you'll just throw in relative. If you want it to change the position for the whole document, you'll just put it in absolute.
Right.
All right, so now we're going to go on the typography. So I'm going to add a heading in here, and we're going to drag that into the div block. All right, so the typography settings allows me to make changes to the heading, very similar to WordPress.
Yeah.
You can change the font sizes, stuff like that. All right, one other interesting that I think we'll touch on here, since there's not too much to go over on the typography section, you'll notice there are two colors here in the styles panel. There's a blue and there's a red. So when I made those changes, I'm going to Command Z twice. So right now a static heading doesn't have any class, and you'll notice they're all orange. That means they're just inheriting the standard settings from the website. So as soon as I change something, you'll notice it'll go to blue. So if I change the weight to normal, it now has given it, at the same time I changed it, it gave it a class. So whenever a style is being applied directly from that class, it will go blue. Oh, does that make sense?
Wow, nice. Yeah.
So let's say I add in another heading, and now let's say I give it another class, which is heading 7, which we really should not be doing that. So you'll notice they both appear blue. So let's now say I give this a combo class and I call it heading 7 large. Now you can see it's the weight no longer is blue because the most recent class is this large one. So if I now apply any settings, it will only apply to the large setting, not to the heading one. So if I now go and change the size, and let's say I do 100, you'll notice that's blue. This one hasn't inherited anything from the size because the most recent class isn't applied to it. So if I now go apply large here, oops, I need to select that large, scroll down, that'll have the same settings, and now you can see it's being applied to blue. If I delete that class and just keep the previous one, it now shows that it's getting the weight from this class. And you can click on anything that's blue, and it'll show, or blue or orange, and it'll show you where it's getting it from. So if I click on size, if I reset this blue thing, it'll show you where I'll get it from. The weight, it says the weight's coming from heading 7. So it's telling me that this setting is getting applied from that class. So when you're going through and trying to look for things, you always want to keep an eye on what's orange and what's blue.
Okay.
So yeah, that's very, very useful. And then when you close something, you'll notice it's showing me if it's orange or blue. So even when I close that, like if I get rid of the two classes, you'll now see that it doesn't have the blue settings because it's not getting anything custom from that. All right, so that's typography. The next section is backgrounds. And so if we delete the headings, we'll add in a div block. So backgrounds allows you to add in multiple things in the background of that item. So you could add in an image, you could add in a gradient, you could add, actually I think these are all gradients, you could add a background color. I think somewhere in here you can add a video, maybe that was actually a background video thing. So let's say you added in, let's see, I don't think we have any assets prepared right now, but this is where you could change, where you'll style the background. So we could right off the bat, let's open up the background. let's just give it a background color, and that changes that. So any settings you want to make to the background of that section are right in here. So if you wanted to add a funky image, you can then start changing the position of it. You can start saying, will it cover? Will it contain? Will it go over several times? Like here's the tiling option and stuff like that. So you'll notice when I click tile, you can have a background image and a color also. So you'll notice it's doing both. Like you can keep stacking. You can keep stacking stuff, gradient and a background image. So you could have a background image and maybe it was of the sun and it was too bright on the top. And so you can keep stacking different background things over and over again. All right, so that's backgrounds. All right, the next one is a border radius. So let's pull out, I think the best way to show this would be with a button. Let's grab one of those out. All right, so you'll notice our standard button. I'm gonna give it some margin real quick under our spacing just so it comes off the edge of the screen so we can see it a little easier. Let's see, maybe a little more. All right, so you'll notice right now the box has blunt square edges. So our borders allows us to grab this and round them off. So we can just up this and you'll now notice it changed.
Yep.
So we can grab in here. So this button changes every corner. And this button allows us to go in and manually set each corner. So we can do this one at 50. We could do this one at 25. We could do this one at 100. We could do this one at 40. And you'll notice it just gives us funky textures to our button. That's the most common time to use borders. The other thing we could do is, let's say we had another button. So let's grab, well, let's just change this. So the background, well, let's see. How would I do this? All right, so right now it's just a solid blue. Let's Command plus to zoom in a little bit here. No, is that gonna work? Let's hide that panel. All right, so right now this button just has the blue. Let's say we wanted to add a border to it. We can now select all the sizes. We're gonna add a border. We're gonna make it 3 pixels wide, and it's gonna be red. So we can now add borders to something. So if you had 2 button types, you had one where it actually had a background color and then the white text, or you had a clear center and just wanted to give it edges, that's how you would go and style it, just right in here under borders. All right, so effects, there's a lot of options in here. This is really useful for like images and stuff where you want to change any of the blending modes. So we'll have to go over that when we have an image or something. You can change an item's opacity right in here. So it hides that. Nice. Another couple of things, you can build some box shadows in here. We can put it away. We can make it a little smaller. We can choose what direction it's from. We can put it on the inside of the box. Again, choose what direction we want it from. So like a nice way to do this, let's say we want to rotate a little shadow. We don't want it to be that far off. I probably want a little more blur. We're going to decrease the size a little bit. And now it suddenly just pops it off the screen a little bit better. So that's how we'd use the box shadows. Transforms kind of get a little complicated, and transitions. Let's see, how would I do this? Let's see, what are some interesting things to cover. All right, another cool option is here in this cursor panel. You can change the cursor when it's over an item. So let's say when we want it to go over the button, we want it to click to a pointer. If I now go over here and I now go over the button, it's now a pointer.
Oh, okay.
So for any of your elements, you can add custom cursors on there. So that's pretty cool. Like if you had something you could grab and move on the screen, you can now, let me grab it. So that's kind of cool. Let's see, we've got some just general filters down in here where we can grayscale stuff, do some other stuff. Okay, so this would be how this would be kind of applied to interactions, but you've got these 2D and 3D transforms. So for example, you could set up an interaction and say on hover, I want the whole button to scale and get a little bigger. And then you could give it a timing transition of whatever. And when you could set up a hover interaction for it to grow and shrink depending on if you're hovering over it. So there are a lot of cool things in the effects, and that's it's either you're using it in combination with the interactions, or you're trying to use it before you use interactions. Because some of the interactions you like have to build manually. So sometimes you can come in here and just quickly grab an effect and apply it much easier than doing a custom interaction. So that is our style panel.
Right.
This is where you will probably spend 90% of your time changing and tweaking stuff, because it's very easy to, Command E, grab a div and pop it on the menu.
Yep.
And now the rest of your time is going to be on this. So once you really get in, once you're probably 10 hours in, you'll almost never use this left side. And it's not like, oh wait, how do I do this? It'll just be, oh yeah, I click it and I do something. Whereas this is where all of your changes, all of your tweaks, and all of the really cool stuff happens. So
wow.
So I think in our next, we kind of started in this one, but I think in our next video, we'll start to grab probably the most common elements, and we'll start to utilize and do changes to stuff. And I'll just kind of show you some stuff. And then it won't be too long before we just hand it off to you and kind of maybe let you play around with stuff and go from there.
Well, it just happens that you just used my last page of note paper.
Uh-oh.
So this must mean I'm ready for a new notepad and be ready for my next session.